Welcome, everyone, to the third Goodman Lecture, presented by Khyentse Foundation. My name is Trent Walker. I'm a member of the Khyentse Foundation Academic Development Committee and a postdoc at the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University. And I'll be your host today. Today's event features a lecture by Professor Dorji Wangchuk of the University of Hamburg, who will be speaking on when can Buddhism be considered living? When can Buddhism be considered dead and when living? For today's event, I'll first say a few words about the series, about Khyentse Foundation, and about our speaker. This will be followed by Professor Wangchuk's talk. We'll then have some time for discussion together. As most of you know, the Goodman Lectures are a monthly online series of talks featuring speakers from many of the Buddhist studies programs Khyentse Foundation partners with at universities in Asia, North America, Europe, and beyond. We hope that these lectures can help create a bridge between academic and general audiences that present bold ideas and innovative research in an engaging and accessible format. And so to that end, this lecture and all past talks are or will be freely available on Khyentse Foundation's website and social media channels. The Goodman Lectures are organized in honor of longtime Khyentse Foundation friend and advisor, Professor Stephen Goodman, who passed away last year. And our series is really inspired by Stephen's enduring vision of making academic talks available online to all. Khyentse Foundation, established by Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, has been supporting Buddhist study and practice since 2001. The foundation is committed to the preservation and promotion of Buddhism around the world and supports a wide range of projects. And if you'd like to learn more about the foundation, please visit khyentsefoundation.org. The Goodman Lectures are also intended to strengthen our network of Buddhist communities and Buddhist studies programs. And Khyentse Foundation is currently working with more than 30 universities worldwide. And for today, we're particularly thrilled to have Professor Dorji Wangchuk of the University of Hamburg with us. And that's because the University of Hamburg is one of Khyentse Foundation's long-term academic partners. At the initiation of Professor Wangchuk, the Khyentse Center for Tibetan Textual Scholarship at Hamburg University was established in January 2011. It has delivered many innovative programs over the past decade that lie at the intersection of critical philology, digital humanities, and traditional textual studies. So let me share just a little bit about some of these programs. One is the Academic Research Program Initiative, which introduces aspects of modern academic research methodology to traditional Shedras and scholars across the Himalayan region, including in India, Bhutan, Nepal, and China/Tibet. Monks and nuns from this region are trained to participate in a variety of academic research projects. In the current phase of the project, it's partnering with institutes in Himachal Pradesh, in Karnataka in India, as well as in Kathmandu in Nepal. Another program is the Indo-Tibetan Lexical Resource, which is an ongoing digital humanities project of the center. This resource serves as an online platform for researchers from the fields of classical Indology, Tibetology, and Buddhology to have a reliable platform for dealing with Sanskrit and Tibetan lexical terms. So we can think of it as a kind of massive, highly searchable, very interconnected, and ever-expanding dictionary for scholars at the intersection of these traditions. And so we're really excited for the future of this project and also its impact on research in Buddhist studies. And finally, I just wanted to mention one of the most ambitious projects of the Khyentse Foundation for Tibetan Textual Scholarship at the University of Hamburg is Buddha Nexus. This is an innovative database that's devoted to the study of Buddhist text and literary corpora in Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and Chinese. And it gives a particular emphasis to the evolution of Buddhist scriptures, the formation of canons, and the intellectual networks that have resulted over the centuries. So users who access Buddha Nexus are able to visualize the way texts, passages, and individual words appear across different Buddhist canons and make grounded comparisons across this vast body of scriptural texts. And it's really through the impressive energy and devotion of Professor Wangchuk and his colleagues at Hamburg that have made these dynamic projects possible. And Khyentse Foundation is honored to have the chance to witness and support them. And indeed, Professor Wangchuk has been long traveling between different intellectual worlds. As far as I know, he was the first Bhutanese person to become a full professor in the West. I've heard that he was first drawn to the study of Buddhist philosophy as a high school student in secondary school in Bhutan. And among other factors, a chance encounter in a textbook of this majesty of Buddhist philosophy led him to pursue intensive studies of Buddhist thought as a monastic student at a traditional Tibetan seminary in Mysore in South India. And after nearly a decade there and completing various monastic degrees, Professor Wangchuk moved to Germany to study classical Indology and Tibetology at the University of Hamburg, completing his PhD in 2005 as the last student of the celebrated Buddhologist Lambert Schmidhausen. And he's been a professor of Tibetan studies at the same university since 2009 and has also taught as a visiting professor at the University of Copenhagen, McGill University, Renmin University of China, and the University of Tsukuba in Japan. Professor Wangchuk's scholarly contributions covered a really wide range of areas in Tibetan Buddhist studies. And sort of looking and thinking about these contributions, I would divide them into four main domains. So first and foremost is that of Buddhist philosophy. As I'm sure you'll experience in the lecture today, Professor Wangchuk has an unmatched ease in citing and commentating on Tibetan philosophical sources. It's a quality that's amplified in his published work. His first monograph, The Resolve to Become a Buddha, a study of bodhicitta concept in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, masterfully draws on a range of Sanskrit and Tibetan texts, drawing us readers into the intellectual history of the Buddhist tradition, really making it come alive. He's also published several articles dealing with the seminal Tibetan thinkers, Rongzompa and Mipam, including their relationship to Yogacara and Tathagata thought. Another field that he's contributed to in many ways is the history of Tibetan books and manuscripts as physical objects, including several pieces that deal with extraordinary moments in and products of Tibetan written culture. Sort of to this end, I would also draw your attention to a fascinating essay of his called Biblioclasm and Libricide in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, about moments when books and other written material was destroyed. Professor Wangchuk, thirdly, his work in textual studies is also very important, especially at this intersection of translation and philology, where he's really helped advance the field, including in the study of particular texts and translation practices. Myself have drawn particular inspiration from his edited volume, Cross-Cultural Transmission of Buddhist Texts, Theories and Practices of Translation from 2016, which to me contains one of his most stirring pieces, a rationale for Buddhist textual scholarship. Although it's not the intention of this article, this piece incidentally provides a really cogent explanation for why the work of his Khyentse Center for Tibetan Textual Scholarship at Hamburg is so important. And then fourth and finally, Professor Wangchuk's Indo-Tibetan Lexical Resource and Buddha Nexus projects at the center have led to a number of publications in the field of digital humanities, really showing the potential for these projects to shape how scholarship in Buddhist studies could be pursued more in the future. So now it's my great pleasure to invite him to deliver his lecture on when can Buddhism be considered dead and when living. Professor Wangchuk, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Trent, for your very generous introduction. And I'm really inspired and encouraged and also very touched. And first of all, I would like to express my thanks to all of you for joining us today. I may also take this opportunity to convey my profound respect and appreciation to Khyentse Rinpoche and all of you involved directly or indirectly with the Khyentse Foundation. My thanks are also due to Kanjuli who invited me to give this talk in the Goodman Lectures series. I offered to talk on the topic, when can Buddhism be considered dead and when living? I wish to reflect, let us say, from an emic perspective on what would characterize the Vita and vitality of Buddhism. I shall do so by exploiting, among other things, the idea of what came to be known as the 9 modes of expertise, tshul gu. That is, at least according to one alternative, studying contemplation and meditation, that is sgom, and exposition, disputation, and composition, that is rtsom, and the knowledgeability, ethical, ascetical integrity, and goodness, bsam. I propose to talk on this topic because I somehow feel that this is precisely what Khyentse Rinpoche and the Khyentse Foundation aspire to do, namely to nurture the Vita and the vitality of the teachings of the Buddha by creating and supporting the infrastructure for the 9 modes of expertise. Perhaps what tells Professor Goodman apart from most of us academics is that he did not engage with Buddhism merely as a dead relic, but was directly involved with Buddhism as a living organism. Now, a few words on historical background of the Tibetan, what I call Tibetan Buddhist Enlightenment. The idea of Tibetan Buddhist Enlightenment as encapsulated in the concept of 9 modes of expertise is a rather recent one, and thus represents the latest phase of the Tibetan Buddhist civilization. But I wish to go back in time in Tibetan Buddhist history and take a fleeting glimpse at the various periods and episodes that eventually culminated in the concept of the 9 modes of expertise. One of the most significant episodes or milestones in Tibetan history seems to be the introduction of the Tibetan writing system and script in the 7th century. Strictly speaking, one might claim that the initial impulse of the Tibetan Buddhist Enlightenment was set through the introduction of, so to speak, Tibetan alphabetology, Bhöki Higi Rigpa or Bhöki Bhöhi Rigpa, and the Tibetan scriptology, Bhöki Yigzu Rigpa, which served as the basis of Tibetan language and script, the Kedang Yige, pertaining to the 2 foremost activities of education and communication, namely those of writing and reading, Dilokni. Tibetans have recognized, as one Tibetan source puts it, that the writing, that is encoding, and reading, i.e. decoding, are the bedrocks of education or edification. The second significant episode in the Tibetan Buddhist history has certainly been primarily state-funded translation projects, which were seen as what I wish to call well-being projects. While we may not be able to fully comprehend and reconstruct the translation processes in Tibet, we can be sure that without the religious zeal, the political will, and economic resources of the Tibetan rulers and people, translation projects that resulted in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, consisting of Buddha's words in translation, that is Kanjur, and treatises in translation, Tenjur, would not have been initiated and completed. Without understanding the religious zeal and the idealistic or utopian Buddhist Welt Anschauung, we may not be able to make sense of the phenomena or the role of translation in Tibet. Tibetan Buddhists believed that in order to guarantee the temporary and the ultimate well-being of human beings on an individual and on a collective level, they needed 2 kinds of belief systems, namely Miche, that is human religion, and Lache, divine religion. The former is said to be the causes and conditions for a desirable mundane goal, be it of this worldly or otherworldly, and the latter, which is de facto Buddhist religion, is said to show one's way out of the quagmire of worldly existences. And actually, it seems to be presupposed that the divine religion cannot thrive without human religion. From a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, therefore, an ideal country is one governed by the royal decree, that is Geltrim, and the Buddhist religious decree Chötrim, also called Dultrim, Labtrim, Sultrim, that secure the two kinds of belief system, which in turn are supposed to procure the temporary and ultimate well-being of sentient beings. Naturally, then, a king who is believed to have contributed to introducing and supporting these two belief systems and thereby building an ideal culture and infrastructure for the activities related to the 9 modes of expertise have come to be regarded as a religious king, Chögyal, and identified to be a manifestation of a certain great bodhisattva. And periods in Tibetan history during which the rule of the two kinds of law were said to be intact have been considered golden eras. What seems to be unique is that the activities of Tibetan translation, initially and mainly of Buddhist texts, have been seen as an integral part of a much larger program of the Tibetan religious kings of building an infrastructure of well-being. It is therefore not at all surprising to discover that the greater part of the early Tibetan religious or political history is a history of the introduction and construction of infrastructure and institutions of religious practices such as temples, monasteries, meditation complexes, statues, stupas, scriptures, and the active participation of the ordained community and laity. Above all, the history of the dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet is largely a history of the transmission and translation of texts from neighboring cultures impregnated with Buddhism. The accounts of the rise and fall of Buddhism in Tibet are often marked by the accounts of the continuation and discontinuation of translation activities. It is thus no wonder that the very identity of the two streams of Tibetan Buddhism, namely the old and the new schools, is defined along the periods of the earlier, or that's the Nganjul, and the later Chinjul translation. Above all, the uniqueness of the Tibetan attitude towards translation of particular Buddhist texts seems to lie therein that the translation or transmission of a scripture or treatise in itself has no spiritual value or validity in the tradition unless it has undergone not just the process of proper translation and edition, but also have been validated or validatable through education, contemplation, and meditation, that is thos, sgom, sum. In other words, Tibetans presuppose that the Vita and vitality of Buddhist teachings transmitted via translated scriptures and treatises can only be said to be extant if these breathe the life of education, contemplation, and meditation, thos, sgom, sum, and exposition, disputation, and composition, that is Khyentse sum. We notice that the 6 activities seem to pertain mainly to soteriology and spirituality, and hence we can understand why the triadic set, explication, meditation, and charitable professional operation, that is she, dub, le, sum, have been added later. The activities and altruistic social engagement is defined as all activities that benefit the teachings of the Buddha and sentient beings. Generally speaking, not everyone can or are supposed to carry out these activities. The endowed with knowledgeability, ethical-ascetical integrity, and nobility of character. In other words, it was not seen enough to be simply educated. One is supposed to be of impeccable and unquestionable ethical-ascetical integrity. Knowledgeability and religiosity or piety alone were not seen to be adequate. One can, in theory, be very well educated, live strictly according to one's monastic precepts, and yet be very cold, cruel, and egoistic. The Tibetan term zangpo here in our sets of 9, which here means something like the quality of nobility, humanity, charity, magnanimity, actually indicates the quality of goodness and kind-heartedness. It is more or less same as altruistic inclination, that's adi ashaya, raktisamba. In the Tibetan latest term, it is simply sampasangpo, a good heart, a good mind. To be sure, Sambazampo is the core, to be sure that Sambazampo is the core value of Tibetan Buddhist axiology or theory of values would be readily and universally acceptable to all Tibetan Buddhists. Now a few words to the uniqueness of Tibetan Buddhism. Perhaps one can maintain that the various forms of Buddhism are equal insofar as they're all unique in some ways. I wish to point out some aspect of Buddhism in Tibet that seem unique to me. First, Tibetan Buddhism seems to have been somewhat unique already during its initial introduction, in the sense that it already presupposed a phase of development that contained all three layers or strata of the three vehicles, that is the Shravakayana, Pratyeka Buddhayana, which constitute what we call Hinayana, Paramitayana or Bodhisattvayana, and Mantrayana or Vajrayana, and four doxographical or philosophical systems, i.e. Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Yogacara, and Madhyamaka. The uniqueness lies therein that a practitioner is supposed to practice the teachings of all three vehicles without presupposing any mutual contradictions. While presupposing a doctrinal hierarchy among the three vehicles, the teachings of the higher vehicles must necessarily be based on or presuppose the teachings of the so-called lower vehicles. This seems to be true not only for the to be expressed, that is Avideya or Jabarjawa teachings, consisting in the three trainings, that is Shikshatraya or Lapasum, but also for the respective Abhidhana, Jabarjapa scriptures and treatises. With regard to one's ethical, ascetical discipline, Shila or Tsultun, for example, which is more conspicuous as a manifestation of one's mode of ethical, ascetical life, one ought to follow the Pratimoksha Samvara, that is a Vinaya precept, as prescribed by the Vinaya scriptures and treatises. Bodhisattva precepts as prescribed by the Paramitayana and other Mahayana scriptures and treatises. And Tantric precepts as prescribed by Mantrayana or Buddhist Tantric scriptures and treatises. The abundance of what we call three precept literature, Domsum literature, alone would bear ample testimony to the uniqueness of Tibetan Buddhism in this regard. The difficulties of practicing teachings of various vehicles by one person without contradiction must have been the main driving force that gave rise to the abundance of this Domsum literature. This would be, for example, in sharp contrast, as far as I can tell, to how various schools of Chinese or Korean or Japanese Buddhism came to be named and defined. It is not possible, for example, to think of an independent Vinaya school of Tibetan Buddhism. There's no such thing. Second, two kinds of spiritual community were in vogue already during the imperial period, namely, community of those who wore white robes and plaited locks of hair, like Gyokar Changlo Chingide, representing a spiritual community of laity, consisting of householder, Grihin or Kimpa, and a community of ordained monks who wore saffron robes, Rabjungurmi Gide, representing the ordained community consisting of mendicants, that is Prabhajita or Rabdujungwa. These two distinct kind of Buddhist spiritual community, namely householders, Grihastha, Kimla Nyapa, wearing white robes, that is Shratambara Dara, like Gyokar Zimba, and ordained ones wearing saffron robes, Kasha Darin or Murmik Zimba, can also be found in the Vimala Prabha, for instance, the commentary on the Kala Chakra, Tantra. In either case, a practitioner is supposed to live, as it is often been stated later in Tibetan sources, outwardly, according to the Pratimoksha Samvara, that is, even as a mantric practitioner is expected to abide by one of the 7 or 8 kinds of Vinaya precepts. Inwardly, according to the Bodhisattva precepts, and secretly, according to Tantric precepts. The underlying key concept here is that the Vajra holder, so-called Vajra holder, Vajrayana practitioner, endowed with the threefold precepts, Sumden Dorji Zimba. In this regard, the technical difference between a celibate Vajrayana practitioner and a lay Vajrayana practitioner is not whether he or she observed 3 precepts of the 3 vehicles. For every Vajrayana practitioner, by definition, is expected to abide by all 3 precepts, but rather whether the physical or external mode of life that one has chosen to live is that of celibacy, that is a bhikshu or bhikshuni, shamanera or shamaneri or shamanerika, or that of a laity, upasaka or upasika. From the perspective of the three precept concept, therefore, the difference, for example, between the current Dalai Lama and the current Sakya Trizin is the kind of pratimoksha sambara according to the Vinaya system that they have chosen to live. The former has chosen to follow a bhikshu's mode of life, whereas the latter an upasaka's mode of life. Thus, according to Tibetan Buddhism, the idea of a married monk, often found in secondary sources, is a misnomer. This concept creates an interesting protocolar difficulty in the society associated with the issues of seniority and spiritual hierarchy. Supposing two Vajrayana masters of equal seniority and spiritual hierarchy, according to the Bodhisattvayana and Mantrayana, but one a bhikshu and the other an upasaka, were to sit in a row, who should sit above and who below? The tradition of the Kalachakra Tantra is clear about this criterion of hierarchy based on the Vinaya precepts. The hierarchy of the Pratimoksha Sambara determines the hierarchy of a master or a practitioner who observes all three precepts. The hierarchical order of precedence between an ordained lay bodhisattva, ordained and a lay bodhisattvas have already been laid down in the Mahayana Sutra Alankara. Third, in order to understand the uniqueness of Buddhism in Tibet, we should perhaps also understand what has been considered the fundament of Buddhism as a living tradition. Following Shantideva, Tibetans have regarded the Buddha's teaching as one that is rooted in bhikshuhood. Shashanam bhikshuta moolam, like a tembetsawa gelongni. There have been several specifications of this idea. Some considered ordained community, Rabjung in general, as the foundation of the doctrine. Sanjigi tembe shi. For some, the sacred teaching of the Vinaya Pitaka, dambe chugi, dambe dului dune, is the root of the doctrine. Tembe tsawa, or the Vinaya as the root of the doctrine. Tembe tenza dulwa. Some considered the observance of Vinaya discipline, lapa suma, as a root. Scholars such as Tsongkhapa regarded Vinaya training and discipline, dulwe laptrim, as the basis of the doctrine, tembe shima. Mivam, for instance, considered pratimoksha practices, the sosotarbe charge, as a root of the doctrine, tensa. In short, Tibetans have come to recognize the Vinaya teaching as a root of the Buddha's teachings, Prajnaparamita teachings as the essence, nyingpo, and Vajrayana teachings as the creme de la creme, nyingku. In short, the idea that the Vinaya and ethical-ascetical discipline, sutrum, should be the foundation of all teachings of the Buddha can be corroborated by a number of other ideas and sources. It would suffice to think of the idea found in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that the Dhamma and Vinaya taught by the Buddha should be regarded as a teacher. The Buddha, when he's gone, an idea that has also been transmitted in some Vinaya commentary literature in Tibetan translation, such as in the Pratimoksha Sutra Padati. And one of the loci classici for the fundamental importance of Shila is Nagarjuna Surilleka, according to which Shila, like the earth, that is the foundation of all moving and unmoving things, is regarded as the foundation of all qualities. Now a few words to the Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, let me make a few points, especially with regard to what kind of Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment or civilization driven by visions and activities of the 9 modes of expertise would be considered by Tibetan Buddhists as living and what kind dead. I hold this to be particularly important. Without understanding this, we would miss the point that is so crucial for Tibetan Buddhism. First, in general, Tibetan sources often allude to the idea of support and supported, tendang tempa. In terms of cosmology or geography, the external world of habitat, that is bhajana loka or neki jikten, would qualify to be the support. And the internal world of inhabitants or sentient beings, sattva loka or semchingi jikten or chuki jikten, the supported, tempa. A support without the supported would always be in principle considered barren, lifeless, and dead. And a support with the supported would be considered, of course, breathing with life. This is true also in terms of the physiology of sentient beings. The physical body is the support and the mind the supported. Obviously, a physical body with the mind would be considered dead, and without it, a physical body with mind would be considered living, and without it, dead. Also, in terms of the Tibetan Buddhist architecture and structure that serve as a physical infrastructure of the modes of nine expertise in the Tibetan cultural sphere, we would notice the omnipresent of what is called the three receptacles, tensum. If you travel to Tibet or in the Himalayan region, you would know that, namely the receptacle of the Buddha's body, that is Khyentse, which refers to images of awakened beings, the receptacle of Buddha's speech, Sungiten, which refers to the scriptures and other sacred books and texts, and the receptacle of the Buddha's mind, Tugiten, which refers to sacred structures called stupas. To be recalled is that these are mere supports. We can buy them from a flea market in Mongolia, or a shop in Kathmandu, or Chengdu, or see them in a museum in New York, in Lhasa, or in a shop window or an antiquary in Germany. For Tibetan Buddhists, these are mere lifeless artifacts. Tibetan Buddhists would certainly not disrespect these objects, for, as instructed by Nagarjuna, they're supposed to accord reverence even to these objects, even when they are made of base materials. So what is it, according to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that would make statues, stupas, and books of scriptures or sacred texts breathe with a life of spirituality and sanctity? Structures such as statues and stupas filled with proper content, nangzum, properly by a qualified Buddhist expert, and those have been properly been consecrated, would start to breathe with a life of spirituality and sanctity. Only such supports that are breathing with the life of spirituality and sanctity can be said to form aspect of the living Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Even those supports that were formerly breathing with the life of spirituality and sanctity, but were later disrupted or desecrated, for example, by burglars or desecrators, or for instance, during the Cultural Revolution, would be considered dead. To revive the Vita and vitality of spirituality and sanctity, they would have to undergo the process of regeneration and reconsecration. So with regard to the scriptures or sacred books and texts too, it represents one of the two aspects of the true or noble doctrines, Dambiche or Sadharma, as Buddhist teachings are often referred to, namely Agama, which is the theoretical scriptural aspect, and Adhigama, which is the practical realizational aspect. Here, Tibetan Buddhists are following Vasubandhu. Usually, the scriptural theoretical aspect of the teaching is expressed in terms of the corpus of Buddhist scriptures called the three baskets, we all know, namely Vinaya Pitaka, Sutra Pitaka, and Abhidhamma Pitaka, under which a fourth basket, Dinishjipa, called the Vidyadhara Pitaka, consisting of Buddhist tantric scripture may or may not be subsumed, and the Indian and Tibetan commentary literature. For the Agama aspect of the doctrine to be alive, there must be at least both the textual continuity, that is Pegyun, and the reading continuity, Lungyun. Although textual continuity, that is the physical existence of a text in the form of either a manuscript, xylograph, or modern book, by itself does not guarantee or implies reading continuity, the latter supposes that the former is extant. A spiritually living textual tradition necessarily does presuppose that the treatise of scripture has both the textual and the reading transmission, since although a disruption of the reading tradition may not necessarily hinder one to engage intellectually in a treatise or scripture, a text without a reading transmission is often seen as being spiritually lifeless. In the worst case scenario, the reading continuity of a text may no longer be extended anywhere. But nonetheless, Tibetan scholars such as Kongtrul Yindin Jamso have made attempt to preserve even these kinds of texts, albeit merely as a historical or cultural artifacts. For us modern academics whose concerns and priorities are different, this might fully suffice. But for living Tibetan Buddhist tradition, however, the mere retrieval or preservation of dead cultural relics is not the only or main concern or objectives. For the living Tibetan Buddhist tradition, it is not at all enough to acquire, for example, a physical book of a scripture and start reading and understanding it. While not totally denying the benefit of such an endeavor, they would not deny, it would still be considered a dead, lifeless tradition. The Vita and vitality of the Agama aspect of the doctrine can be said to be extant only if transmissional continuity, lungyun, is maintained through the medium of textual continuity, pegyun. Ideally, even this is not enough. Ideally, the textual continuity and transmissional continuity must be accompanied by so-called expositional continuity, shegyun, and instructional continuity, trigyun. In other words, the Vita and vitality of Buddhist scriptures and other sacred treatises can only be guaranteed through the activities of the 9 modes of experience, especially through thos, sgom, that is education, contemplation, and meditation, and exposition, debate, disputation, and composition. Similarly, physical structures and infrastructures such as temples, monasteries and monastic seminaries, meditation complexes are all supports. These two would be considered lifeless if there were no supporter, namely ordained or lay persons endowed with the qualities of these Khyentse Zangsum or Sulting Shersum, like Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, who actively carry out activities of the 9 modes of expertise. This also implies that the mere existence of ordained community and practicing laity would be dead and lifeless if there were no activities of 9 modes of expertise, especially if the ordained community and practicing laity have not received, for instance, the proper unbroken lineage of the 3 precepts, and if they don't observe them properly, that would be comparable to fake monks and nuns in touristic areas dressed up as monks, Buddhist monks and nuns. The Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism is thus can be said to be based on Tibetan Buddhist monasticism, which in turn is defined by the Vita and vitality of Vinaya. The Vita and vitality of Vinaya, however, is defined not merely by the existence and transmission of Vinaya scriptures and treatises in the Tibetan canon, but by a living Vinaya tradition that is sustained by the activities of the 9 modes of expertise. Even today, there exists a living Vinaya tradition in various schools of Tibetan Buddhism. There are Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns who are Khyentse Zangsum in the domain of Vinaya. That is, there are many Tibetan monks and nuns who are well versed in the field of Vinaya. There are numerous Buddhist monks and nuns who strictly adhere to their Vinaya precepts, and many who render their charitable service to the teaching of the Buddha and sentient beings. One can also state that the activities of Che, Tse, Tsom, Sum related to Vinaya are also very much alive. Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns study, for example, Gunaprabha's Vinaya Sutra and his numerous Tibetan commentaries such as the famous Tsotik. They debate on Vinaya matters. They still compose works on Vinaya topics. One can say that the Vinaya associated Thosam, Gomsum, and Che, Tse, Tsom, Sum activities are still alive in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. The activities of Gom Drup, like a Gom or Drup meditation and practice in the Vinaya context may be understood not merely in the sense of transmission or study of Vinaya scriptures and treatises, as if they were lifeless religious or cultural artifacts, but more so in the sense of what I call applied Vinaya. The basis of applied Vinaya seems to be the engagement in the so-called dealings of 3 fundamental affairs. So it's a technical term, so-called gsum choga or gsumgi choga, namely observance of rainy season routine. There's a varshika, yarne, revocation of the prohibition imposed in the period of rainy season retreat, that is pravarana or gaye, and fortnightly confession, uposatha, sojong. Implementation of these Vinaya precepts presuppose, among many things, the most important of all is the existence of Vinaya qualified ordained community, which in turn presuppose an unbroken Vinaya genealogy. These aspects seem to be so crucial for understanding the raison d'etat of the Tibetan monastic traditions. If the practical application or implementation of the Gsum Choka does not exist, the Vinaya tradition can be said to be dead. But the practical application and implementation of the Gsum Choka is very much alive in numerous Tibetan Buddhist monasteries across Asia today. We cannot afford to forget or ignore the fact that all the activities expressed by these triads apply only to the Vinaya and Tibetan Buddhist monasticism. Tibetan Buddhist monasticism is certainly the broadest basis or widest framework for all the activities of the Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment civilization. But Tibetan Buddhist monasticism is by no means coextensive with Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment or civilization, which is much more. In order to get a glimpse of the Vita and vitality, the breadth and depth of Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment civilization, it seems necessary to explore at least these 5 venues. First, a careful and comprehensive study of the various monastic academic syllabi or curricula, both from a diachronic and synchronic perspective, seem desirable and beneficial. Second, also a careful and comprehensive study of the various monastic academic degrees and titles would also help us understand better Tibetan Buddhist civilization. Third, what seems to be utterly important for Tibetan Buddhism is the assumption that the Vita and vitality of Agama and Adhigama aspect of the teachings of the Buddha can only be guaranteed through the uninterrupted lineage or continuity of their genealogy. This applies not only to a single aspect of Buddhist teaching, but all 10 fields of knowledge, Vidyasthana, Rikpine, and to various branches and sub-branches of Buddhist teaching, and even to individual Buddhist scriptures and treatises. The desire to and the need to document the genealogical continuity and vitality of the various fields of knowledge and work seem to have given rise to incredibly informative so-called records of teachings received, saying, just think of the 5th Dalai Lama saying. Fourth, the most important and the tangible testimony for the Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism are of the the various and numerous scientific and artistic works of Tibetan Buddhist scholars belonging to various fields, subject matter, and genre. Fifth and finally, the present Dalai Lama, for example, often emphasizes that Buddhism in Tibet is practically a continuation of great monastic seminaries of northern India, particularly of Nalanda. Indeed, if you consider major Indian treatises, Buddhist treatises, that are directly or indirectly associated with scholars linked with the monastic seminaries of Nalanda and Vikramashila, and those that have been translated, transmitted, studied, commented, and debated in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic seminary, Dalai Lama's statement is justified. To the depth and extent that Tibetan Buddhist scholars intellectually engage in the works by or ascribe to scholars linked with the monastic seminaries of Nalanda and Vikramashila, Tibetan Buddhist monastic seminary traditions seem unique in the world of Buddhism, even to this day. What I've attempted in this talk today is to reflect on what I wish to call Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment, in the quotation mark, by trying to place the topic within the framework of the so-called 9 modes of expertise. We've also briefly touched upon some historical background of the Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment, the uniqueness of Tibetan Buddhism. Finally, we also discussed a few points that are pertinent to the Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism. While this is admittedly an initial attempt on my part, I hope that I was able to give you a glimpse about the idea of Vita and vitality of Buddhism from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective through the lens of the 9 modes of expertise. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope, thank you.
Thank you so much for that most erudite and illuminating lecture, Professor Wangchuk. Thank you especially for sharing your detailed view on this idea of the Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment, particularly through the lens of the 9 modes of expertise with us and its application to this issue of the vitality of the Buddhist tradition, particularly in the Tibetan context. So we'll now have a period of discussion. And as I mentioned before, if you'd like to ask a question, please send a chat message with your question to KF Q&A via the chat feature in Zoom. The KF team will then relay selected questions for me to pose to our speaker. And since there are many of us here today and our time is limited, we won't be able to get to every question, unfortunately. So while we're waiting for some questions to be submitted, I hope you won't mind, Professor Wangchuk, if I ask you a few questions of my own.
Welcome. Yeah, of course, please.
So I'd like to start very simply with this term Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment. I just wanted to clarify, you're using this as a historical or sociological framework, or a way to describe the different elements of vitality that you've laid out for us. I'd just like to understand a little bit more about what you mean by this term.
Of course, I'm a little bit inspired by the notion of enlightenment in Europe or in the West, where many different fields of sciences were studied. You could question, you could debate, you could write, you can even go against the divine authority or whatever. So I was thinking the kind of the way, rather the attitude of intellectual attitude, and in the intellectual milieu or atmosphere where you can actually express your subtle differences, you can debate, you can write, you can explore, and so on. Mostly from the perspective of intellectual engagement or attitude, rather, not so much in a social, on a broader social level.
Great, thank you. And that relates to this other question I have, because this, as you describe it, this Tibetan Buddhist enlightenment, this attitude, as you've explained for us, is connected, at least at some stage in history, as you put it, to the framework of the 9 modes of expertise. And one thing you did in your talk was lay out some of the foundations that eventually led to this framework in the very early period of Tibetan history, that of the imperial period, in the early translations, et cetera, and the formation of the Tibetan writing system. But then I'm curious about, when did this specific framework of the 9 modes of expertise come into vogue? And what was sort of the reason or context for its formulation?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. Actually, if I may just give a background of this paper, I was involved in a project dealing with some of my Japanese colleagues, and that the project's name was Vihara. It's like a monastic traditions. And those colleagues asked me to represent the Tibetan side. And I somehow started thinking, and indeed I thought, these 9 modes of expertise seem to somehow represent, but true. I had a longer version of the paper that I left it out because I was trying to trace the individual history of the individual components of the 9 modes of expertise. And it's true that they are not of the same. It's a rather very late development. This constellation or this systematization of the 9 seems to be rather late, maybe 19th century. But some individual components you can find, like not all 9 but the building blocks of these 9 can be found, some of them even in Indian sources. For example, I say thosam gomsum. This is implied in many Indian sources, including Vasubandhu. For example, just look at the pranya, like the insight. So you say shruta mayi pranya, and you get bhavana mayi pranya, and chinta mayi pranya. So these already presupposes 3 sets. And also some important, it struck me that among the last 3 components of this 9, it was a bit surprising, because especially the social aspect, social engagement aspect, which I call Jawaleki Koro. This is called the Korlosum. So that one is also supposed to socially actively engage. But in India, I've had the feeling that this did not apply to ordained monks and nuns, because I was surprised to see, it's actually, I forgot, but they emphasize that monk or a nun should be like a mendicant. They should be reduced in their activities and concentrate on something, like they have to practice meditation and live in a hermitage, etc. So they were not supposed to socially engage. But I think some Tibetan Buddhists thought that this is not sufficient. So they need to also actively engage in the society. So that means even today, some of the monks or the nuns in the monastery, they would be working, doing other things, but not necessarily studying or meditate. So you could also have division of labor. Of course, not one person can do all the 9, of course. I think some of the Tibetan Buddhists would like to remain like a Milarepa. They go to the caves and meditate. That would be the priority, actually. That would be the best kind of a choice. But other people do other kinds of activities. So yeah, in short, the building blocks of these 9 can be found earlier, and also some of them even in India, but as a set seems to be rather later sort of systematization, maybe 19th century systematization.
Thank you.
I don't know if I partly answered your.
Absolutely. No, that that really helps lay out this historical framework for understanding this term of the 9 modes of expertise and how it developed. And I want to come back to what you were saying at the end, because we have some questions about this question of social engagement and laity and monasticism that I'll get to first. But shortly, rather I'll get to shortly, but first, there's a question around the 9 modes of expertise. Would you be able to just say them again, this term, the Tibetan term for the 9 modes of expertise, and then what the 9 are again in Tibetan and English? Thank you.
I must admit, first of all, I must admit that not every Tibetan source seemed to agree the enumeration of the 9. So just to be clear. And so I thought I will not discuss. In Japan, I had a sketch, I had a table, but I thought maybe this is going to be complicated. So, but maybe just for the time for our discussion, we can say that Kepe Tsulgu would be Chetse Tsomsum, like Thosam Gomsum is Thosam Gomsum would be studying contemplation, meditation. Chetse Tsomsum would be like a teaching, exposition. Tserpa is a disputation, like a debating, and then composing works, etc. And Khyentse Zangsum, the constellation is a bit complex. Keba, you have to be very much learned. Like Tsumba is observing one's strict Buddhist ethical-ascetical discipline. And so Tsumba, and Zampo is really the social, I call nobility or humanity, the charity aspect. So this last component is directly linked with the social engagement. So you have to be noble in your character, and you want to help. You want to do charitable works. You are noble in your attitude or in your heart, and you want that is reflected in your social engagement. So the Zampo is linked with the last. I mean, the last one is linked with social engagement. So these would be the 9.
Thank you. And this, what you were mentioning about social engagement relates to several questions that audience members have posed around the role of the laity and the relationship, this monastic lay relationship in connection with this question of the vitality of the tradition. So one audience member writes, in Tibet, were the monastic and lay/yogi communities functionally parallel or culturally somewhat independent, or did the monastic culture was perhaps more connected to political power and tend to dominate this lay/yogic culture?
I suspect that in various phases of the Tibetan history were different situations, various situations. But let us say from the imperial period, especially like the Tiralpas period, like maybe let us say 9th century or late 8th century or 9th century. So we have very old records where there were tantric yogis, like who are not celibate, yogi, lay people, married people, but still practicing. So these would be what I call the late, like a practicing laity, so to speak. And then there would be like a strict, like a monk according to the Vinaya system. So these were recognized as 2 kinds of Sangha, which is probably a bit unprecedented, because in Indian context, you would not consider the lay people as a part of the Sangha. They are at the periphery. But the term like a 2-day, like 2 kinds of Sangha itself suggests that they were given also a lot of respect, because they're very yogis formed, let us say, just to be simple, yogis formed another Sangha. But after the downfall of the Tibetan Empire, I suspect that the Vinaya was disrupted in central Tibet, and they had to run away to the eastern side. And during this vacuum, there were only yogis, hidden yogis or grassroots yogis, let us put it, I would like to call grassroots practitioners were there, anonymous. But after decades, these monasticism returned to central Tibet. Now you can understand there was a gap. So there are also probably some conflict, tension between the 2. And this can be sometimes reflected in some historical works, this tension. And then afterwards, after the 12th century, I think depending on the various tradition schools and sub-schools, for instance, the Sakya tradition has a very interesting combination. that it's a kind of a family sort of tradition. So you have on the one side representing one line, and on the other side you have family members who are representing the other line. And this is also kind of a duplicated, or let us say somewhat in Mindroling, for example, in the Nyingma. So in the Mindroling, you have Lochin Dharmachari representing the Vinaya, emphasizing the Vinaya, but the Tedalingpa, so Tedalingpa was representing another kind of a Sangha, but they are working in union, right? But later on after the 17th, 18th century, especially
it's 20 hours.
For example, within Nyingma tradition, for Payul, it became predominantly monastic. And Kato also, like, so you have mixture or some predominantly monastic, etc. But of course, if you look at the political history, it happened to be that I think during Pagdu period, it was not necessarily monastic, but from the Gaden period, of course, let us say incidentally, the rulers happen also to be monks, and that would have consequences on the social, political, and also religious aspect, right? So it's not, in short, in the history of Tibetan Buddhism or Tibet, I think these were not always same. So it differed from different periods and different places, etc.
And to just ask one more question in this direction, in your talk, you mentioned so much around the importance of the continuity of the monastic tradition, the integrity of the Vinaya, yes, as a foundation for the vitality of the tradition. One audience member writes, would Tibetan Buddhism be alive without the Tibetan layperson community?
Rationally speaking, no, I think, because this is not recognized, but it is a new sort of a discovery also for, I feel that it's also a sort of a new realization for today's monastic community, because, and retrospectively, we can now project ourselves to India. So it's not recognized, but just theoretically imagine, Buddha was living in India and they were like a monastic community, but the very broad basis, the fact that the monastic community can exist presupposes that there is a layperson support, right, or endorsement. So without the lay support, monasticism will not survive, because in the Indian context, you have the lay should support them, and you go begging, and there must be some Buddhist laity who would give them their daily, I don't know, sustenance, etc. So if there are no laity, this is not possible. And this is true also in Tibet. But maybe this, to some extent, this was recognized by Tibet. It occurred to me that there's a famous song by Milarepa where he says, Dala Pula or something like that. So Milarepa, he's a practitioner, he's detached from the world and meditating in the cave. But then he says, but there must be somebody to give him some food. Otherwise, how would he be able to practice? No? So then he said that, yeah, both of these are essential. So I think we have to somehow strive to get awakening together. That's what he said. And he wished the person who support his meditation and the meditating, they get awakening together. So this is, in my view, a kind of a recognition that we cannot survive. Spiritual life cannot be sustained without laity.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in around this issue of how do we define or understand the vitality or lack thereof of Tibetan Buddhism today. So we have one question on this that's coming from Professor Sarah Jacoby, who will be giving a talk in this very series for us in October. So looking forward to that event as well. And her question is, what's your opinion on the present day vitality of Tibetan Buddhism, however you take this, in Tibet and its diaspora? Do you think that academic Buddhist studies, as conducted, say, in universities internationally, support the ongoing vitality of Tibetan Buddhism? Or does it focus too much on the empty husk of texts that are without their living essence that you described in your talk? And are there particular ways that academic Buddhist studies can better support the ongoing vitality of Tibetan Buddhism?
Thank you. It's a very important, good question. I think among our colleagues in the West or academia, not only I should not say West because academia everywhere, like in Korea, Japan, and Tibet, and South Asia, etc. I think there are all sorts of academics. I would like to call, as I mentioned in the beginning of my paper, that Professor Goodman is not only an academic, but he's somehow involved. I felt that he's also engaged in keeping up, or in some way supporting through the Khyentse Foundation and so on, keeping this Vita and vitality alive. But not everybody does this. I mean, we don't have to do that, because we can even sustain, as I said, as an academic, we can still study Buddhism as a dead relic. It's sufficient, it's okay. But maybe some of us may like to do a little bit more than just studying Buddhism as a dead relic, but maybe perhaps even as a living organism, and together with the intellectuals, I mean, some who share the same intellectual pursuit from the tradition. And this is exactly what our RP is doing. And I think that we
just to clarify, this is the academic, can you give the full name of the RP project?
Yes. Yeah. Academic Research Initiative, RP, project initiative, like Academic Research, Academic Research Project Initiative is indeed, we have a couple of visions, and one is we want, let us say that Buddhism is like a target, I mean, like an object. I mean, if we believe that there is such a thing as a target, and every one of us, be it from the Tibetan tradition or from any elsewhere, we wish to understand the target and hit at the target. And it would depend whether we are able to hit, or maybe sometimes for different reasons, some people may come close to the target, some people not, etc. So I thought we share the same sort of vision, interests, and we can learn from each other. This was my presupposition, because there are some techniques that we can acquire from the modern academic approach, etc. But we cannot afford to lose what the tradition has. This is another concern of mine, because therefore I was forced to compare the living tradition of Tibetan Buddhist academic institutions with the rest of the Buddhist cultures. We really have to ask, we really have to ask this question. In which Buddhist culture do we still study all the great Indian treatises and its commentaries? Where? Show me. Yeah. Not an academic. Okay, I can go to a library and look up Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyama Karika. This can be done, okay, without. But if we really go to the different schools of monastic, like you go to Sera Ganden or you go to Namdruling, you see people are still memorizing it, debating it, trying to understand, read many comments, read Prasanapada, try to read Buddha Padita, and then see how different Tibetan scholars have been interpreting and so on. So this sort of engagement, I feel, would really be pity if this goes away from the earth. If we lose this, it will be pity. So, okay, to try to be short, I think if we understand how they work, and if we understand, I think we can work together as a team, we can benefit each other, because we share certain dreams, we share certain interests, and I think we can learn a lot. And I'm really happy to see these RP scholars, I mean, these scholars that we are training. I'm so proud of them, and I feel that now they can take any discourse at any level without fearing or being offended. They push everything, they're ready to put everything on the table and question, analyze, and deepen, and try to understand what the text or what the author wants to tell us, like what, for example, Mula Madhyama Karika wishes to tell us. So I think this pursuit is a good development, and if we work together, I think we can, in this way, if we treat them as partners, I think we can profit, we can benefit each other, but not just simply as an informant, like say, okay, it's almost a pejorative, say, oh, they gave me the information, so I'm the big guy who is going to make the decision, but they just feed me with information. This attitude, of course, is a little bit unflattering. And I think that if we define if we know our interests, if we share our interests, we can benefit. Profit, the word profit doesn't sound nice. We can benefit from each other. Let's put it this way.
Thank you, Professor. That's such a moving, inspiring, broad-hearted kind of vision for the importance of this kind of collaborative work. So thank you for that. We have another question coming in around the issue of vitality and how to define it, in this case, as it relates to language. So one attendee writes that Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche mentioned that nowadays the Tibetan language is changing. Tibetans, for instance, who grew up in India are shaped by English. Those who grew up in China are shaped by Chinese. And when they speak and write in Tibetan, it's in conversation with those foreign influences. Could you speak some to how the way the Tibetan language is changing? How might that be connected to the vitality of the tradition?
How do I frame it? Of course, let us say now, I mean, it's not confined only to Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but to the entire Buddhist cultures and traditions, is that we have inherited incredible number of Buddhist scriptures and treatises. Unlike the monotheistic religion where you have an important scripture, especially Mahayana Buddhism have lots of scriptures and treatises, shastras and sutras and tantras. And these have been, with great effort, have been transmitted to us. Fortunately, through the digitization, through the preservation, through the efforts of Jin Smith and many others, we're able to have direct access. And anyway, and one unique thing in the case of Tibetan, we're even able to understand things written in the 7th or 8th century. And it doesn't make so much of a difference whether maybe a 21st century Tibetan scholar have composed or whether Peltsik in the 9th or 8th century have composed. If you are versed in this language, you can understand. Yeah. So now, so in this sense too, the monastic tradition seem to play a very important role. I mean, the monastic academia seem to play an important role because the medium of instruction, or ironical or paradoxically, the classical Tibetan Buddhist language seems to be a lingua franca of, let us say, every culture where there is Tibetan Buddhism. Interesting, right? Even in Tibet. So if you use our local language, maybe someone from Amdo may not be able to communicate with someone from Central Tibet and vice versa and so on. And Bhutanese may not be able to communicate with Tibetans from Mongolia, I mean, the Buddhists in Mongolia, etc., if we spoke our language. But let us say a trained scholar, someone's trained in this Buddhist languages, is able to communicate. So if we lose our competence to read these sources would almost be rendered, there would be nobody to really take care of. As I said, physical preservation of these books and texts and xylograph alone is not enough. There's debt. So we have to use the language to assess, evaluate, to understand, even to translate and so on. So these go hand in hand. I believe that these go hand in. Also for us, for philologists or for historian of ideas, I think we cannot do without it. So Tibetan monastic milieu, I think, plays an incredible role, especially in the preservation of the language. And this is also one reason why we initiated our project at Buddha Nexus, etc., because sometimes it's not sufficient just to say Tibetan language or Buddhist language or Buddhist Chinese. Is not enough, because I think we have to first think there are many Buddhist ideas in different languages, and how do I access these ideas? Then you realize, many good scholars realize, you have no other way but to know that language, be it Tibetan, be it Buddhist Chinese, be it Pali, be it Sanskrit, and so on. So in other words, it will really be pity if we cannot access the material that we have. I mean, intellectually barred from and we cannot only rely on someone else's to explore the world of Buddhism found in the text. So yes, I don't know if I'm to the point, but so through these activities, you can see the use of language and how also at the same time you try to preserve the language or actively use the language. Of course, clear that the modern people, modern youngster, like a youth, of course, they are not trained. If they are not trained and they cannot read, and it's obsolete and it's not interesting, etc. It's understandable. It's just true, but with the physics, for example, physics or chemistry, whatever, if you don't study physics, maybe even a physics book, we cannot be able, just because I speak English, it doesn't mean that I can understand a physics textbook, right? This is true also with Buddhist philosophical scripture and treatises, I think. So preservation of the Vita and vitality of Buddhism, even as an intellectual engagement, presuppose that we have the command over the language. Otherwise, there's no way that we can access it.
Thank you. That's really helpful in understanding this relationship and the importance of a language in terms of access to the text and the continuity of the textual tradition. You also were speaking about the importance of the monastic training in that context. And another attendee writes, thinking about the spread of Tibetan Buddhism outside of South Asia, not only just in Tibet and Bhutan and Nepal and places in India, but also say in Australia and Japan, Taiwan, North America, Europe. What is the importance of having a complete monastic tradition with fully ordained monastics in those other regions for the vitality and the transmission of the Dharma in those regions?
Maybe we should first clarify one premise is in the Vinaya, it is said that suppose there are Buddhist monks in India, and if I invite 10 of these to Germany and they live here, so the question is, now has Buddhism come to Germany? No. According to the Vinaya, no. Just because you have imported some monks from other, it doesn't. There has to be German monks. So if it is in Africa, there have to be local monks and nuns who continue this living tradition. Only then you say, oh, Buddhism has finally come to Africa. This is what one could say. So if you're just importing like some Tibetans to Australia or Germany, Tibetan Buddhists, Australia or Germany, doesn't imply that the Buddhism has come to. So as a living tradition, the Germans have to, I mean, if theoretically, hypothetically, in order for Buddhism to take root in Germany, there have to be German local monks who sustain themselves by the German society. So it is difficult, as you can see. Yeah, but nowadays it's really global. We live in a very globalized context, and there are all kinds of Buddhists, let us say, from 1% to 100%. I mean, you define oneself. There is no strict criteria that, oh, I am 50% Buddhist. It's very difficult to say something like that. And in general, I feel that there are, like, people get inspired by Buddhist teaching for their personal reasons, and some people study Buddhism because that somehow intellectual is very engaging, is stimulating. So there are all sorts of people, even among students, there are different kinds of people who want to study Buddhism. And I personally experienced that. I said there is a tabula rasa kind of students, and there are students who come from a deeply rooted in Buddhist traditions. Both have their advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes it's easier to write on a tabula rasa, but of course there's a danger that I may end up indoctrinating these young minds. So, but I think in a globalized context, if anybody, regardless of our background, ethnic background, religious background, if you are interested, and given the proper training, given the proper access to the sources, anybody can access this, right? Spiritually and intellectually engage with this. And so in a way, the future, because of the accessibility of sources, I think anybody can engage either intellectually or personally or spiritually. And there's no restriction or confinement to any particular region, particular place, and so on. So I don't know if I answered this question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. We have two other questions that are sort of building off this and thinking about the relationship between vitality and texts and consecration and other aspects. So one thing that you mentioned in your talk was this distinction between agama and adhigama, between the scriptural theoretical dimension and the practical realizational kind of dimension. And one audience member writes that the vitality of the agama tradition lies in the vitality of its transmission genealogy. Mm-hmm. And so in this audience member wants to know, when you're using agama in this context, is it referring to all agamas, all texts, all agama, or to individual sutras or texts? So when we're thinking about this idea of, you mentioned different kinds of continuity, reading continuity, expositional continuity, instructional continuity, what does that mean in the context of a particular text, say an individual sutra or shastra?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course, I was meaning in a very broad sense, for example, avideya and abhidhana, or so something that is expressed and something that is expressing, etc. And as I said, the Tibetans are actually leaning on to Vasubandhu, who says that the teachings of the Buddha are of two kinds. You can say, and one is adhigama and agama. So in very general terms, of course, and each Buddhist tradition have, of course, its own notion of what agama is, of course, right? I mean, for example, Theravada tradition would have its own very specific notion of agama, but the Tibetans have a very broad. It might include both tantras and sutras, but it might even include shastras, right? So it's a bit vague. But I think as I started reflecting on this Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism, it always reminded me of what, for example, Kongtrul Lodithai did. Kongtrul Lodithai wrote a catalog to the so-called Shangpa Serche, the golden teachings of the Shangpa Kagyu. And Rebecca Hufen, this is her topic of her magister thesis. And so I happen to know through her work a little bit. And it was so interesting to see how Kongtrul arranged these works. And he said, so there are all kinds of texts that belong to this corpus of so-called Serche golden teachings. And then he was collecting, of course, physical books and texts, etc. First and foremost, and always trying to find out, do we have a lung for that? So he would, if he heard, he has to really try to retain his lung and go ask who has a lung, and then sometimes he would travel far and wide to find out who has a lung and try to receive it first and then give it to his students and so on. No? So this is how you continue the lung. And by the way, this is also what Teda Lingpa and Lojin Dharmashiri did with some teachings of the Karma tradition. Now, but he realized that unfortunately, many texts had no lung whatsoever. So you have physical text, but it's like buying a book from the train station or whatever. So you don't have any connection, spiritual connection. I think we need to understand somewhat, there must be something personal and immediate with this idea of lung. Of course, you can understand many ways. For example, I have tremendous respect for a certain master, okay? I'm just giving a theoretical. And I don't care whether this Lama has a lung, but if he sits with me and reads with me or studies with me this text, I'm okay. I fully, somehow my connection with this Lama and his reading with me and trying to understand, suddenly brings back life to me. And this is what I cherish. Not just because I found a text somewhere, but this Lama read with me, thought with me. So somehow I feel that this Lama helped me to breathe some life into this dead relic. I think this is what Tibetans were meaning. This is my personal impression that, so sometimes some lamas, important lamas, did revive the lung. This is very interesting. They did manage to revive the lung. And don't ask me how, but they did revive the lung. So if I look at Kongtrul's, what he did, or what Teda Lingpa or Lojin Dharmashiri did, it really made me think that how important it was for them. You know? And this is still true, even to this day. So you really ask, do you have a lung? If I study, do you have a lung for it? Yes. So I really saw that otherwise they would really think, I mean, the Tibetan tradition would think that this something is dead about it. So it's still not breathing with life. This is also true with the statue. If I really buy a statue from a flea market in Germany, it is not the same as the same statue that is sitting in the altar of a Rinpoche. It's not to be. So somehow Tibetans instinctively feel this is not the same. It's, again, as I said, it's not that the Tibetans would disrespect such an object that's bought from a flea market, but there is some sort of a sentiment that is not attached to that object. Whereas the object that is sitting in the altar of your Lam master has some element, aura of life that is already breathing somewhere. I think, okay, I hope that I'm not misrepresenting Tibetan attitude or mentality, but I have a feeling this is what the Tibetan tradition is thinking about. Therefore, I said, if you don't try to understand this, we'll miss the point, because there are certain things very important for the tradition. And we cannot concentrate on something that is trivial from their perspective and ignore things that are so central for the Tibet. So my whole paper was motivated to try to understand what is so important for the tradition and why is it important. I think if we manage to understand this, I feel that we are somehow trying to understand how they feel or what is important for them, and not focusing on something that is completely irrelevant for them. So this is the whole context of my Vita and vitality of Tibetan Buddhism.
Absolutely. And I want to bring this to a close soon here, because we've gone on a little bit longer than expected, because there's been so many fascinating questions, and because it's been such a pleasure to be in dialogue with you in and with these questions. But on this point that you've just raised around the importance according to objects that have been consecrated, that are sitting in this particular ritual setting versus those that aren't. It sounds like there's this possibility for objects, for stupas, for Buddha images, relics and the like, to become rejuvenated, to become reanimated. That you mentioned that maybe that could happen in case of a lost transmission for a text, and perhaps that couldn't happen in the case of a lost monastic lineage, but it certainly sounds like it could happen for an object. And one audience member asks, they're trying to understand more about this, what happens in that moment of consecration with regards to your terminology of vitality. So is there a shift from presence without vitality to a presence with vitality? And if so, what happens? What is the essential shift there that we now know that this is alive, this is not dead, this is living? Thank you.
Yeah, it's very difficult, almost like a psychological phenomena. We know there are people who have studied so-called consecration, right? If you build a new stupa, it's not just the old lifeless stupa, but even when you're building a new stupa or a new statue, or whatever. And this idea of raptur nepa is like, we just translated consecration and so on. Of course, we shall for the time being forget about the tantric rituals involved in it, what the lamas do to what lamas do to bring life or breathe life into this lifeless object. But it is a little bit ritualistic, but it has enormous psychological impact. And this we cannot afford to ignore. And this psychological aspect of seems to be very vivid or very clear, may become very clear if I just mention one. For example, I cannot get a monastic precept, like a Vinaya precept, from somebody who has no precept. This is clear. For example, I'm getting a bhikshu ordination, and I must get my bhikshu ordination from someone who has the bhikshu ordination. I cannot get it from somebody who doesn't have, in theory, in principle. But there is a very interesting case in the Vinaya. hypothetically, when you go to your ordination, there is the chairman, so to speak, the main abbot, and there are committee, other members. Each one has a role, minimum 5, but you can have 10, etc. So you, for example, assume that everybody was qualified. Your Kempo had your abbot had the monastic precept, but later on, retrospectively, you realize you found out that Kempo has no bhikshu precept when he gave you the precept. And now the monastery, this text has a very interesting statement. He said, in the moment you realize that he had no Kempo, you lose your vow. But you had got your vow because you assume that everybody had the precept and you performed the ritual took place and you got your vow. But you lose in the moment you thought that he had no vow. So what does it teach us now? So it's a kind of a very complex sort of a relationship, and our assumption, our samkhya, our notion played an important role, right? So I think even in the context of consecration or getting an initiation or even getting a lung, etc., there must be this notional interaction taking place, and there must be the notional assumption that something is happening, and only then in this framework it will work. Otherwise it will not work, of course. I believe that, so suppose if you are sleeping, if you doze off when somebody is giving a lung, you will not get the lung. That's what it is said, right? So what does it mean? If you are sleeping, your notions are no longer present, but if you're awake, your notions are there. So this notional involvement is so crucial apparently. And this is true not only in tantric context, it is true for the Buddhist context, but this is even true for the Vinaya. That's what I wanted to tell. So I guess, let us say, I just guess that this, the premise is that this whole thing works with all the notions present, that taking for granted that these things is how it operates, and it would have consequence for the members involved in the procedure. But otherwise, if you do not believe in the first place, or if you dozed off, or if you're drunk, then nothing happens. So I assume that all the reconsecration, regeneration, the initiation, etc., would take place within this framework. But the Nyingma tradition, the Terma tradition, have another solution. Is of course you can revive the lung through a terten, right? Which is another technique to regenerate the sanctity or spirituality.
Thank you. On this note, let me, and on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for this lecture, and particularly your discussion and the way you were able to engage the many questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them that everyone brought to you today. It was a really, I think, very full of life and enlivening. And I think, for me, I've also learned from the powerful way you use language in terms of this commitment to precision in translation, and also terms that may surprise us at first, such as knowledgeability for K, this term ethical-ascetical integrity for tshul, or even the way you juxtapose Vita and vitality, which gives us this other lens, this other way of accessing this term and the questions that you've raised for us all today. So I feel very fortunate to be able to share this time with you, and thank you for accepting the invitation to be part of this series.
So thank you from my side. I also wish to thank again, Khyentse Rinpoche is not here, but I really thank him. I'm a great fan of Rinpoche, and Khyentse Foundation, I have a lot of appreciation for all our friends and colleagues from the Khyentse Foundation, and how much a difference the foundation is making. And particularly, thank you for your generous word. And I really felt that you made an attempt to understand what I'm doing, and I really felt a little bit encouraged and touched because nowadays, I mean, we have not so much time, and nobody's so much time to read other people's works and so on. So I really, I'm very thankful that I felt that you really wanted to see what we are doing, and I felt that you really appreciate what we are doing and so on. And also, I would like to thank all the audience for your participation, for your questions, and for attending. I know in somewhere it's very late, but still you took the trouble to attend this. So I thank my sincere thanks to all of you. And of course, as I said, this is just a preliminary sort of reflection. I'm sure there are many things to deepen, to make it more precise, and to even to reconsider some of the things that I said. But I hope that it was nonetheless as a sort of a basis for further reflections and thoughts. So thank you so much to all of you, and particularly thank to you for this moderation. And I really felt comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let me close here by just drawing your attention to the next talk in the series by Professor Jacob Dalton of the University of California, Berkeley. His talk on Tibetan Tantra at Dunhuang will take place on Friday, September 24th at the same time as this event. So if you're on the Khyentse Foundation mailing list, you'll receive more info about Professor Dalton's lecture in early September. And as you may have seen in the following few months, we'll have talks from Professor Sarah Jacobi of Northwestern University, Professor Imre Hamar of Ethical-ascetical University, and also from Professor Peter Skilling of Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. Again, for more information, visit khyentsefoundation.org/events and khyentsefoundation.org/the Goodman Lectures. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well. Thank you.